Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Meet the Winemaker event this evening. Just getting you all admitted in. So while we do, let me introduce myself. My name's Catherine from the Tastings and Events team here at the Wine Society, and we are very much looking forward to this event this evening that we have with Dr. Laura Catena and Toby Morrhall, our buyer for Argentina. Before we get going, and Toby will do a much better introduction for Laura, I just would like to give you a little bit of housekeeping for the event this evening. So we've got Anna from the Tastings team also on the webinar, and she is behind the scenes at Tastings team. If you have any technical difficulties this evening, you can drop her a message in the chat by directing it to the Tastings team name, or you can drop her an email directly using our email address, which is tastings@thewinesociety.com. Now, we'd love for you to use the chat this evening and let us know where you are. And if you're drinking any of the Katena wines, you could let us know what they're like, what you think of them. And if you have any specific questions that you'd like asked, please pop those in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both, but it does make it easier for us to have them divided so that we can ask them as we go this evening. Hopefully you're very well versed with Zoom over the past 18 months. But again, if you have any technical issues, drop Anna or myself a message or email us directly. So I think, Toby, it's over to you now. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, and welcome to everyone. And we're absolutely delighted to have Laura Catena with us tonight. And I'm not going to speak for very long because I think it's going to be great. And I'm sure you will want to hear from Laura, not from me. But I've been visiting Katena probably for about 30 years. And when I first went out, I think in the early 90s, I think Katena were just planting this amazing vineyard called Adriana, which was at 1450 meters in Valtellerie. And no one knew if it was going to actually ripen grapes, and there was snow at springtime and snow at autumn, and it was a real gamble. And yet Katena had the spirit and the know-how to plant these vineyards. And I think the quality of their vineyards and the quality of their people is what really sets them apart. And I think they're making tremendous wines. So Laura will give a presentation. I mean, Laura is a real doctor. I mean, she specialized for a long time in accident and emergency, and she was there at the sharp end in hospitals in the States doing triage and looking after incredibly seriously injured people, and how she manages to marry that with her job at Katena, which I think she's taken a slight backseat, so she said, on the medical front, but she's still vaccinating people, and she's written 2 books. The recent one is Malbec, Mon Amour. So I won't keep you any longer, but just to welcome Laura and say we're delighted to have you here and looking forward to listening to what you have to say. Laura, hello.
Thank you, Toby. Or actually, I will call you Toby, which is what everybody calls you in Argentina. And it is true that you've been going to Argentina for so long. And the funny thing is, when Toby comes to Argentina, everybody gets a little nervous because he is very picky. Like, he is, you guys, you should know that he is looking for the best wine for you. We know that he is very demanding in the quality. And thank you for saying so many great things about us as a producer, because coming from you, Toby, I believe them. And when Toby comes, everybody says, "Oh, Toby's here." And so, we have to show him all the best wines. And I think that you can see it hopefully in the result of the special wine we make for the Wine Society. And I want to make one little comment about how after a year and a half of not traveling or not being able to get on a plane, I arrived to London, where my sister actually lives there, and I was visiting some customers. My first trip actually to outside of Argentina was to the UK, and I arrived to the Airbnb after being on the train and exhausted with the mask, and I could barely breathe because it was up a hill. And I walk in, and right there in front of me on the table there was a bottle of a Côte d'Iron from the Wine Society. And I immediately said, okay, I've come to my home and Toby's here, and it was a wonderful feeling. And I then convinced the people who were renting the place. I said, now that you've tasted France, you have to taste Argentina. And ever since, we've been connecting on WhatsApp, and they have become big fans of Katena from the Wine Society. So it was just a beautiful moment. So thank you for making that moment possible, Toby.
Well, that was lovely, and I must say I really enjoy when on my visits to you. It's one of the highlights of my trip, and particularly tasting wines with your winemaker Alejandro Vigil,
Oh, he
who's an
adores
absolute genius, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And he's a visionary, isn't he? You plucked him, I think, from the research department. So you're very clever, and I think you've always you've always had the vision, and you've always employed very, very bright people, and I think that combination sets you apart.
Well, thank you. I call him our Picasso because, he's very creative, very artistic, but also, as you said, he's a researcher. And it's very hard to find people who have those two worlds inside them. And he does. And that's what makes him just so talented, but also so much fun to work with.
He is great fun, isn't he? He's always laughing and joking, but serious. And as you say, he's got the creative vision and the technical scientific background. And wine is a mix of art and science, isn't it?
That's right.
And I think you achieve that beautifully.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, if you want, we can start with the presentation. And then, of course, I love questions. So if you put questions in the chat, I know that Anna and Catherine are going to be looking for the questions, and I love to interrupt the presentation to answer any questions. So this is a photo that I like to share because it's of my great-grandfather in the middle, Nicola Catena, and his wife, Anna Moscheta, and their 6 children. And the one with the older one, the one to the left of Anna, is my grandfather, Domingo Vicente Catena. And it's a beautiful family shot, but I like to show this in presentations sometimes to just show how far the world has become for women, because this is a photograph that's on the wall of our grandfather's home, where we often stay in Mendoza. And I once asked my father about this photo, and I said, tell me about this photo. And he said, yes, my grandfather, Nicola, the handsome man in the center, was very proud that he had left a winery and a vineyard to each one of his sons. And I asked, well, what did he leave for his daughters? And my father said, well, he was equally proud to have found a nice husband for each one of his daughters. And I said to my father, well, I found my own husband. I want a winery and a vineyard. And, I'm now working at our winery with my sister, and my brother has his own projects, but we're all partners. And it's a wonderful thing to be leading this family winery, but I am the first woman. And I have to say that I'm not sure what Nicola, my great-grandfather, would have thought of a woman running his family winery. Hopefully he would have liked it, but I'm not sure. So anyhow, let's see the next slide. So this is our winery, which is a pyramid. And my father started this revolution. As Toby was saying, he planted in places where people thought grapes would not ripen. And this was necessary to make wines that could age, wines with complexity and natural acidity. If you farm in places that are too warm, you get alcohol and a little fruit, but you don't get the kind of complexity that we get from, our really fine Malbecs, the wines that we are drinking today. And so my father moved most of the production to the Uco Valley from some of the more traditional areas that were closer to the city. And remember that we've been making wine in Argentina since the 16th century. So the city was where you had to be, or at least close to it, because in the olden days, you had to go by carriage with the horse. And then you had the train that went by the city that carried the wine to Buenos Aires. So most of the vineyards were close to the city. The Uco Valley is a little farther from the city. And that's part of the explanation for why it wasn't as developed. And my father really moved viticulture to these cooler climate areas by the Andes Mountains. And this was a very deliberate move in order to make these kinds of wines. And the reason why he picked this pyramid shape was that he went looking for what should he do for his new winery, which would be in the cooler climate area. Remember, we've been making wine since 1902, but he decided in the late 90s, I'm sure Toby was there and saw the beginnings of the construction. Toby, were you there for the construction of the pyramid?
Yes, I was. I just started, I think. I think my first visit was around 92. So yes, I think I was there.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, so basically my father said, should I follow the path of doing an Italian style building, a colonial style building, a Spanish style building? Our name is a mix of Spanish, the Zapata, and Italian, the Catena. The Spanish is my grandmother's side, Katena is my grandfather's side. And he said, you know what? No, I don't want to copy a building from Europe. I want to do my own thing that honors this terroir by the mountains that doesn't exist in Europe. And I'm going to show you some slides where you're going to understand just how different it is to farm in Argentina. And so he happened to have been to Central America. And my father he studies history every day. He spends 2 hours reading history. He knows a lot about the Romans, and he loves military history. So right now I'm getting a lot of messages from him, but he also is very interested in the history of the Americas. And he shares this love with my sister, Adriana Catena, who actually, she's the one who lives in London, who's now working with us, but who actually studied in UK. She has a PhD in history from Oxford. She was an academic for a while, and now she's working with us. But they share love for the history of the native peoples of the Americas. And so when my father went to Central America and he saw these beautiful Mayan pyramids, he said, this is what I want to do. I want to honor the native civilization of the Americas, the Mayans, who were so advanced in their agriculture, in their understanding of mathematics, in their language, in their understanding of the stars. And this was the inspiration for our pyramid. And you will see in many of our labels, there'll be a little drawing of the pyramid on the label. So the next one. Okay, so this is where I want to explain to you how different Mendoza and the high altitude wine country is from the regions that you might know in Europe, or even in places like Australia, South Africa, the Northern America. So our region is defined by altitude. And actually, this is also a difference we have with Chile, which has mostly an ocean influence, is what brings cool climate. Our climate is more different than the climate of Chile than, let's say, Bordeaux and Burgundy. It's very, very different because we have continental influence and Chile has ocean influence. So, you've got the Andes on the western side, and then in the middle of the triangle that is Argentina is Mendoza, right next to the Andes Mountains. And so the temperature changes dramatically as you go up. So I'm going to explain this chart. First, you see where it says region, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to the left. This is a classification by a professor called Winkler out of UC Davis in California. Then classification, cold. So the smaller the number, the colder. Then you have cold temperate, warm temperate, warm. Then where it says some degrees Celsius, that is a summation of the 6 months before harvest, of the degrees over 10 Celsius. So that number, the smaller the number, the cooler the region. And then we have local areas and international areas. So I want to start at the international areas that I'm sure many of you know quite well. So cooler regions would be places like Champagne would be cooler than Burgundy. You also could put Alsace in there. Then a little warmer is Bordeaux, La Rioja, Barolo. Then a little warmer yet is Chianti Classico, the Napa Valley. And then even warmer would be Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the Upper Galilee, for example, in Israel. So if you think of France, to go from Champagne to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, it's about a 7-hour drive because the difference is given by the latitude, not by the altitude. If you are in Argentina, trying to go from zone 1 to zone 4, so you see here Gualtallarí Highlands down to Lulunta, that would be a 45-minute drive. So this is the big difference in our region. We have very different climates, very close to each other. And Anna, let's see the next slide. So this is a little bit about the geology, because people often ask me, okay, so the temperatures are different. We understand that. We know that when we go up in altitude, it gets cooler. What about the soils? Now, the soils are also different. So this is a very simplified diagram of the alluvial soil formation. So when you hear the word alluvial, that refers to water. So it's either glaciers melting or rivers melting. But it's not, the river that came through yesterday. We're talking about rivers and glaciers from millions of years ago that brought down materials that then, became compacted, and those are the soils where we make wine. So if you think about it, and you will see here on the left, it says stones and limestone, sand and clays. There you go. Oh, thanks, Anna, for putting that circle. So the closer you are to the hillside up on top, the more you will see big stones, because when the river was trying to carry these bigger stones, it couldn't because they were too heavy. And so you see more rocks, more big stones higher up. Then in the middle, you see more sands, but usually you also see some gravels, some stones, and then you see more clays, which are the finer material further down, especially if there was a lagoon. There's a place called Agrelo, that's where our winery is located, where there used to be a lagoon millions of years ago. And when that dried up, it left a lot of clay. So not only is the temperature different in these different sites, but also the soils. And what that gives us is the capacity to really grow grapes and make wine that tastes very different from places that are very close to each other. And, I remember the first time I went to Burgundy, I was so struck by the differences in the wines from little parcels that were next to each other. And I remember thinking, that's so beautiful, but it's probably not like that in Argentina, because also the French people would tell me that it's not like that in Argentina. And then, when I started studying the soils and the climate with Alejandro Vigil that Toby was talking about, this very talented winemaker, we realized that we also had these big differences, and that was a real gift if we knew how to use it. Is there a question, Catherine?
Yes, there is.
Oh, perfect.
It stemmed from the Winkler scale that you just shared.
Yes.
The differences in the altitudes and what you just touched on in the differences in soil. And we've had a question about whether you actually, as you have that available, do you grow at all the different altitudes, or do you have them to your disposal, but focus more on certain areas?
Yeah, so I love that question, because that is the question that my father and I asked ourselves multiple times per year, and lots of debate, because you have two approaches when you have these very different regions so close to each other. So you can actually make a blend of, let's say, a Malbec in the different regions, or a Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think we're going to be having one of those Cabernet Sauvignons that's a blend from different altitudes, but they're close to each other. So, if you're a winery trying to make a great wine, you don't want to mix things from very far away places, because you don't want to carry the grapes because it gets hot, and you want to really be close to your vineyards. However, here we have a situation where we have places really close to each other at very different altitudes with very different flavors. So we came up with this technique, you could call it, of what I call high altitude blending, which is taking the same variety from vineyards that are fairly close to each other, but at different altitudes. And I call that the Chanel number 5 approach. Why? Because Chanel number 5 has these beautiful components, but every year they change. They put a little more, a little less of one or another. It's never the same. And in our case, the yearly change comes mostly from the vintage, which is different. But we also sometimes change the percentages, but the components are always from the same place. So that is one approach that can give you really beautiful, elegant, texture, just like kind of a wine where you get everything you want. It's a high altitude blend. But we also make wines that are from a specific place, because what we found was that it was hard to two things. One of them was that when people would say to me, well, I had sometimes people say, oh, all Mendoza Malbec tastes the same. And I would be shocked. I would say, are you kidding me? There's so many different terroirs. And then I needed to show them the wines that were so different. And I was making these blends. So we actually started making wines that were single region, and we call it our village wines. But then we said, we even have vineyards where there's two parcels right next to each other that have different flavors. And so we've also made wines from, two parcels in Adriana, the vineyard that Toby was talking about, that are right next to each other, but very different. So in answer to your question, which is such an important question, I think in Argentina, we can make beautiful wines both ways. Now, it's likely that the blend of the altitude will be more consistent year in and year out, because we change it a little bit. Let's say one region, has hail and the production is really low, we can put some of another region. And the individual wine, let's say you have a clay soil vineyard like Agrelo, and you get a lot of rain, the clay really soaks up the rain. That year is not going to be the greatest from that vineyard. On the other hand, you might have 3 other really good vintages from that place. So that's the difference. But we take both approaches that you asked about. So great question. Thank you. So Toby, you want to make a comment?
No, I just would be very interested also. I don't know if you plan to talk about it, but what I thought was amazing was the work you did on the different clones of Malbec, where I think it was Pedro Marchevsky at the beginning. I mean, you took, just to explain your project, because I think that's very fascinating. And I think also it's very interesting. I mean, you have more Malbec, you have much more Malbec in Argentina than they do in France, don't you? And so you have a lot of genetic diversity. And I think that, as well as your fantastic vineyards, your search for the best clones of Malbec has been revolutionary in quality. Would you just say a few words about that project?
Yes. That is, that was my first project at the winery. So it is it's ingrained in my body, that project. And actually, if somebody wants more information on that project, the Jancis Robinson Old Vine competition. So did you see the entries for this year by any chance, Toby? Because one of them was written by my sister Adriana, and she won the popular vote. Did you know about this?
No, I didn't. I must look that up.
Yeah. So actually, maybe if Kendi, who's on this call, can find the link and put it in the chat to my sister's winning submission. And believe me, I've written all these books, but she writes much better than I do. Oh, it's already there. And this actually really explains in such a beautiful way the story of this 100-year-old vineyard. It was planted in 1922, and how we made this selection. But I'm going to briefly tell you all, because Toby is right that people always talk about terroir. They're talking about the soil. Now we're talking about microbes. They're talking about climate, but they often forget to talk about the plants, which are like the people. And we would be nothing without them. No soil can give us wine alone. And because of phylloxera and because of grafting, there has been a reduction in diversity in many parts of the world, because when you are creating vines for grafting, it's easier to have a few mega plants or mega clones. And when I say mega, I don't mean it negatively. It's like, you have a certain clone that gives you really good quality. Well, you're going to make 100 of that and make these big plants that you can take a lot of cuttings from to graft. So it's easier to have a more narrow selection. But what a lot of us, and that's natural that people thought that, but what a lot of us today think, and actually my opinion is shared by people like Aubert de Villaine, who is looking for genetic diversity in Pinot Noir that have been lost, and they're tracking old vineyards to make sure that those selections are not lost. So in our situation in Argentina, this is one of the few good things to come out of being this kind of lost country with this crazy economy that nobody came to for decades and decades because they were too scared. But so what happened is in Argentina, from the time that Malbec came in the 1850s to the 1990s, really no Malbec entered Argentina. We had the selections that are very diverse that came before phylloxera, because there was a Frenchman that actually is hired by the Argentine government to set a vine nursery. And that same Frenchman brought the Bonarda and the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Chardonnay and all these other varieties. But Malbec happened to take really well. And Malbec, what's interesting about Malbec in Argentina is that regardless of where you grow it, it makes a decent wine. So yes, of course, that you go to Adriana vineyard and it's glorious. And, it's been called the Grand Cru of South America. that's like a whole higher level. But you might have a really simple Malbec in some other parts of Mendoza that are just gorgeous wines, and maybe a little lighter, but still really beautiful. And so I think Malbec just adapted so well. But all the vineyards in Argentina are ungrafted, at least 90% of them. We are now grafting in some regions because of water scarcity with climate change. We have the necessity to use grafting because the American rootstocks require less water. But really, most of the vineyards in Argentina are ungrafted, which means that they're not grafted on an American rootstock. And what happened, though, is that the way we propagate vineyards in Argentina is most people don't even go to a vine nursery. They basically go to their neighbor and say, you know what, I really like the wine you served me last Sunday that you said came from that vineyard. Can I have the cuttings? And it's very rude to not give your neighbor your cuttings because that's just traditional. That's how it's done. And so a lot of people in Argentina have the cuttings from this really famous vineyard. And sometimes they'll complain. I had somebody complain. They said, I'm so mad that I took your cuttings. I'm like, oh my God, what happened? And they said, your yields are so low. And I said, you should be happy. You're going to make great wine. He's like, no, but I didn't want such low yields. And I said, I told you, you saw the vineyard. These cuttings cannot give you volume. It's impossible. And then they said, okay. And now they're actually really happy because they're actually making wine and they're grateful. But, that's the one issue with these diverse selections. And, they were not made for volume. And so quality is great, but it's not easy to get high yields. But in the end, it's good for the consumer because you get.
But Laura, you studied what, 100, 200 plants over a number of years?
We have 135 cuttings.
Yeah.
And we plant in every one of our vineyards, we plant the Masal selection, the 135, because the Masal is mostly, we just go and select. Then the 135 are distinctive rows, one per clone. And then we have 15 clones that we plant per parcel. So we'll have one parcel is one parcel is the second one. And we now have a nursery where we're preserving all this material. Because now you need to test for viruses. The same thing that happens to people with COVID is actually there for vines. The fact that we humans have taken over the whole world, and now the separation between nature and people is becoming so much more narrow. It's also been an issue for plants, and not just vines. I mean, there's anybody here in the crowd who knows about agriculture, like citrus, everything, chocolate, like. Viruses are an issue for viticulture, and they don't affect people. Like, don't worry, you're not going to get a virus from a wine, but they affect the vines. So now you have to actually do there's all these procedures that you need to take before you plant a vineyard to make sure that the material is clean, that the actual vines that you're planting. Yeah.
But you started out with how many, and you narrowed it down to how many?
So there's probably in the vineyard, there's like, I don't know, 900 individual plants because. Yeah. And then from that, we chose 135 that we thought looked healthy, that had small berries, small clusters. And then we always plant the 135, even if we have a real range in terms of some of them are much less productive than the others. But what we find is that when they're all together in a vineyard, they kind of rise up to the occasion. They ripen somewhat similarly. It's this, that there's all these studies that show that trees talk to each other through their roots. So there's not as much research done in vineyards as there are in forests. But if forest trees talk to each other, why would vineyard roots not talk to each other? So I'm quite convinced that these vineyards are like living communities where all the vines are interconnected. And that's part of the magic of these diverse selections. It's like a team of people. Like, you would not want a team of Laura clones. Like, we would drive you crazy. Like, you would quit like immediately. But there's Laura and Toby and Kendi and Liz and Catherine, and now we're talking. It's like. And
you don't know what diseases will come in the future, do you? So you want
Exactly.
a diversity to protect it against what may come in the future, which we don't know about.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt, but I must say I've been so impressed by that aspect of your work. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, no, okay. So this is a slide of the Adriana vineyard that Toby saw in its birth moment. And I mean, this is so beautiful. And I mean, every time I go to this place, I am struck by how gorgeous those mountains are with the snow and the sunlight. And you do have to wear a hat, even if I have a lot of English people like you that come and say, I don't get burnt, and they don't wear a hat and they inevitably get burnt. Toby, have you been one of those people that don't wear a hat and get burnt in Mendoza?
Well, I'm very sensitive, and I know just from trying to take a photograph of someone, the strength of the sunlight is so big that you have to take photographs of people in the shade. And I got burnt once when I was young, so I'm very careful. But it's very strong, the sunlight, isn't it?
Yes.
Especially at the higher altitudes, isn't it? And that's part of, a bit like humans, where we develop a suntan. I think you've been explaining that the grapes with the ultraviolet light grow thicker skins, and the skins is where the flavor and the color comes from. And so the high altitudes are real, although it's difficult for us humans, it's very good for the grapes, is it not?
Yeah, well, Toby, that's actually great that you're mentioning that, because that's kind of, I was talking about climate changing and soil changing. The other thing that's really important about high altitude is sunlight intensity. And we couldn't understand why the grape skins were thicker and there were more polyphenols at high altitude, because just the cool climate and the low yields alone couldn't explain it. And we did this really cool research with covering, like shielding one part of the vineyard from the sunlight, but you were still seeing the light, but you were just covering this one, what you get at higher altitude, the UVB rays. And what we found was that the grapes were thickening the skins probably to protect the seeds, because although we reproduce vines by cuttings, they don't know that. They think they're going to reproduce by seeds, and you wouldn't reproduce by seeds, because then it would be potentially a new varietal, and you're trying to get more Malbec or Cabernet or whatever you're planting. But we know that the skins over 1,400 meters elevation are thicker, and we have more polyphenols. And this is another reason why these wines at fairly high altitudes are more concentrated and age-worthy. Yeah.
Just while we're on the topic of the Adriana vineyard, we've had a question come in from John Senior. He's got a couple of questions, actually. The second one is more general. But the first one, he's asking, with the combination of altitude, sun, soil, and climate, is there anything that could make the Adriana vineyard even better than it is? And then as a general, vineyard sort of winery question, are there any pests and other diseases or issues that are difficult to deal with? And if so, what do you do to cope?
Yes, so I'll tell you, it's the first question, could we make the Adriana vineyard even better? Well, I'm certainly sure that's possible. But personally, my main concern right now is preservation. I feel like we have found gold in a way. And actually the second part of the question is part of the answer, is there are pests, new pests all the time. We have these vineyard viruses, you have nematodes, you have phylloxera. Even with grafted vines, eventually the grafting will not work. And, you're going to have to breed vines. Like Toby said, you need to retain a lot of genetic diversity in case a pest appears, that we don't have the protection against it is not in the vine material, because we don't have like the millions of years of evolution happening, because we humans mixed everything up. You used to have, certain animals and plants growing secluded in an island or in the southern hemisphere. Now everything gets mixed up. So first of all, to answer the first question, I think that we found some pretty amazing flavors in the Adriana vineyard, and mostly right now my priority is to protect them. Am I looking for more? Not actively. We microvinify. We have, probably over 100 microvinifications for Adriana every year. What's better or not as good, that will depend more on the vintage. But the 5 sites that we've identified as our Grand Cru sites, I don't expect that to change, honestly, right now. I might find another parcel that I like as much in the future. That's possible. But I feel like the ones where we have found the gold, mostly we have to make sure to preserve them. And that's easier said than done because of all these threats. We have a threat of water shortage. That's a big issue in Mendoza, and that we are working all the time. The whole province, everybody is worried about it. And we have to fight against, like, recently they wanted to put mines that would have access to one of our rivers. And basically the people went out in the streets in Mendoza. Everybody went out. Even people who didn't work in viticulture, because, you know, it also can affect your drinking water. And there's threats like that that could wipe us out, you know, hopefully not. And it's, you know, it's not like all mines are bad, but, you know, I certainly don't want to share a river with a mine. You know, I think that it's too risky, you know, and, you know, they need to find another place. This is what, but, you know, like literally it was going out in the streets to prevent it. So things like that I'm more concerned about.
I guess one thing that might improve, obviously, is the vines get older.
Yeah.
They'll have better roots, a better root system. They'll probably have less vigor, and they're naturally more balanced as they get older, aren't they? I mean, they're already, some of them must be already 30 years old.
So I would say right now we're at a peak of amazingness. I mean, this 30 years old is, I mean, those vines have really deep roots. We have, this is another thing that, you know, when I was going to France, people would say, oh, you know, if you irrigate this crap, you would have superficial roots. And we have roots consistently 2 meters because there's no underground water in our place. The water goes in and out. So it's, I mean, we have a lot of terroir differences in this vineyard. So I would say, I don't know that, you know, when these vines are 50 years old, they're going to be better, Toby. I'm not sure. I can't imagine, like right now, their yields are very low. I wish they were a little higher, actually. They're very low because we're also organically farming here, which usually reduces your yields. The vines look, you know, happy, but a little stressed pretty much all the time, which is what you want. But honestly, I don't want to stress them anymore. You know, I think vines are like people, you know, a little stress is good, too much stress is bad. So I don't know that this is going to get better when these vines are 50 years old, but I could be wrong. Maybe they will. I think they're pretty amazing right now. Yeah. But I think other parts of the Adriana vineyard, we are working to see if we can get the kind of Grand Cru quality from other parts. And that is ongoing work. Yes.
And in terms of threats, I mean, you don't have much rain, but when the rain comes, it tends to come at vintage time in quite large amounts, doesn't it? And you have a very high risk of hail every year. Those are things that you have to intelligently fight against, isn't it?
Yeah, so the biggest problems are basically hail and frost. And, you know, this was one of the issues why my grandfather was very concerned about my father planting in where he planted, was because there was the fear of frost. And that was, you know, that is the big fear in Mendoza, frost. And in the Uco Valley, there's a lot more frost risk than in the east, although there's also risk in the east. But the great thing about Adriana is that it's on an incline. So we really have not had big frost problems there. The hail, basically all of the, what we call Grand Cru parcels in the Adriana vineyard are covered in hail netting. And as long as you keep the hail netting in good condition, usually you can prevent the hail netting, you know, the hail from causing significant damage. The rain question you asked is good. The problem, you know, is when it rains a lot and you're in a clay soil or in a not well-drained soil. So usually when it rains in Adriana, we have so many stones in that vineyard and it's so well-drained that I can't remember ever having rot in Adriana. We just don't get rot.
No, because mostly you plant vineyards, don't you, on silty soils in Eugenio Bustos, in very sandy soils. Agrello probably is the one exception, isn't it?
Yeah, Agrello is the one exception. Everything else has either limestone or gravel or loam, which is, you know, that mix of, you know, sand, a little bit of clay and stones. So really, the rain it can be a problem also in the east, especially if it's hot. So that's the other thing. You know, you have a vintage like 2016, when it rained a lot, but because it was cold, we didn't really get rot. The rot you get when it gets really warm. So I would say the rain, it can be a problem. Like 2001, 1998, El Nino, it rained for 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a long time. And I predict that every 10, 20 years, we're going to have one of those years. So it is.
But I mean, Mendoza's a semi-desert, isn't it? I mean, you normally have 200 millimeters of rain a year, but the distribution is around February, March, isn't it? Which is when the vintages. That's a problematic thing, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not as problematic as people think when they're there. I've had a lot of European producers. They come and it rains 3 days nonstop, and they said, "Okay, it's all over. Bye-bye vintage." And I say, no, it's gonna be fine. If you wait a little bit till everything dries, it's less of a problem, but it can be a problem. Yeah,
that's why you planted on these very well-drained soils, the silt and the sand, so it isn't a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I wouldn't want to miss out on the Agrillo soils. The wines from there are beautiful too. So I mean, my view is, I'm willing as a farmer. I feel like so many bad things happen that if I have, every 5 years, 1 year is not as good, I'd rather have the other 4 amazing years and have that 1 year that's so.
Yeah, and you're spreading your risks, aren't you, with this combination of different vineyards, different soils, different altitudes. That's a nice insurance against specific problems.
That's the main insurance, is having vineyards in different places. Exactly. It's like your stocks, having different kinds of stocks.
I think we may be being prompted to look at tastes and wines, because time is moving on.
I was going to say, members, we do have some questions coming in, so we'll come to those after, but let's have a little look through the wines, because talking about the variation you've got, it really does produce some beautiful wines, and I think we may have some very thirsty members that would like to hear about them, Laura.
Have they been waiting all this time to
Well, I hope not, because I certainly haven't. So
good,
members, you've done better than me.
Good. I hope that everybody's tasting. So Catena Alta Chardonnay comes from 2 vineyards at altitude, one at 3,600 approximately, the other one almost 5,000. And it's the same Dijon clone. So they're cuttings that we brought from France. And the idea for this wine is that it should have, the minerality of the high altitude, but also because of a lot of surface stones in Domingo, and also in the little parcel from Adriana where they come from, we do get a little bit of creaminess. And we like that. We like this wine to have minerality and a little bit of creaminess. I've been told by many people that it's like in between old world and new world sort of wine, that it's got some, warm climate aspects and some cool climate aspects. And I like hearing that, because I personally like to drink both kinds of wines. And this is a wine that you take it to a friend's house and they drink it instantly. I don't know what your experience has been, Toby.
No, I like what you said, mix between old and new world. And that's also one of the wonderful things, wasn't it, about planting the higher vineyards. Chardonnay is an early ripener, and here you've got very natural high acids, bright fruit, lovely freshness, haven't you? And you don't need to acidify. And actually, sometimes you need to do the mallow, don't you? Because almost sometimes you have too much acid. So I think it's wonderful. It's so fresh and bright, and I think those wines are very drinkable, and I think they go better with food than the big sort of New World fruit bombs. I mean, this is so elegant and restrained, but one glass leads to another, I think.
Yeah, that's what I've been told. Yes. And these wines can even age well. If you ever have an old bottle, they're really delicious, and very good with food. I mean, I love this wine. And Alta, as you might know, means high, and it refers to the high altitude, but also to the high quality. And actually, quiz question, Toby, do you know what Catena means in Italian?
No.
Okay, so all of a sudden, I realized that nobody knows what Catena means in Italian. Like during COVID, I got asked by somebody, and then I kept on asking people, and nobody knew. So Catena means chain in Italian. So in Spanish, it's cadena. And so people often think our name is Spanish. So they're not thinking of Italian or Latin, but Catena means chain. And I always think that it's the chain of mountains, even if it comes from Marche. But anyhow, so Catena Alta, it's from the high chain of mountains. I don't know. That's how I imagine it in my head.
It's a nice name.
Yeah. So, okay, so the next slide, maybe we go, let's just go through, because are we supposed to finish at 30 after, Toby?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go through. Okay, so this wine is a blend of altitude. So I've already told you all about that. So different climate, different soil. This is the Chanel number 5 concept. And 2020 is a really nice vintage because it was actually a little bit on the cooler side, not very high yields. Again, one of those years that Toby likes, but we don't like as much because we don't make as much, we don't have as many grapes.
Buyers love low yields.
Exactly, I know that. But this is a really good vintage, great quality, and I mean, I've had this wine, and the idea with the oak, I like what it says here: oak used but not noticeable. So most people don't know this, but Malbec has natural vanillin. So we actually found this when we did this research of Malbec from different places. A lot of people were identifying vanillin and they were saying, yes, this wine has oak. And we were saying, no, this wine does not have oak. We know it because we made it without oak on purpose to be able to distinguish the characteristics. And there's other grape varieties that also have vanillin, like Shiraz can have that. So you have to be very careful with Malbec. If you use too much new oak, it's going to soak it up and it's going to ruin your wine because it's going to be all oak. And I know that for sure, Toby, you don't like wines where the oak is occluding the fruit. And so we are very cautious and careful. And we also practice non-recipe winemaking, which is every vintage is a little different. You can't just every year you say, I apply 20% new oak, 10% new oak, 30%. You have to taste the grapes and make a decision about how much new or second or third use barrels you will use. And that's really important. And that's where Alejandro, I think, is just so great because he hates recipes, and his team is like him. We adapt the winemaking to the terroir, not the other way.
La materia prima is different every year, isn't
La
it?
materia prima,
so
exactly.
you have to adapt. And I think what you're doing is lovely because you don't like too much new oak. I think like everyone, probably second and third use barrels seem to be the best. And I know you're moving a lot from 225 to 500 liters. So that you get you get the oxygen, but not too much oak. I think it's a very nice balance you're developing.
Yeah. Thank you.
We should maybe taste the Catena Alta Cabernet.
Yes. So the Catena Alta Cabernet comes from, you'll see on the label, it says historic rose. I have a bottle somewhere, but not right here. But you'll see that it says historic rose. And what that means is that there's certain little parts of the vineyard that have historically always given us great quality. And if you go visit any vineyard in any part of the world and you ask the vineyard manager, is your vineyard all the same, or do you have a favorite spot? They will inevitably tell you, my favorite spots are that little hillside by that, tree over there, and then this little spot over here, by the river or whatever. And so the historic rows refer to these special rows in the vineyard. And this particular Cabernet comes from 3 different altitudes. And also latitude is a little different. So La Pirámide is in Agrelo, that place I was telling you about with the clay soils. And what's interesting is that Cabernet Sauvignon is a little, in Argentina, it likes a little less stress than Malbec. Malbec is a variety that deals with low water, high stress, farming that we have in Argentina because, as Toby said, there's not a lot of water. Cabernet likes a little less stress, because the Malbec roots are so deep. Cabernet roots are fairly deep too, not like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay that are a lot more shallow, but Cabernet likes a little more water, a little more friendliness. So this vineyard here in La Pirámide that has some clay soils, I really like it because it gives us a lot of texture for the Cabernet. Now for the pyrazines, that spiciness that we all love about Cabernet, you need the cooler climate. So that's where we go to Domingo and to Nicasia. Nicasia is in Altamira, which is in the south of Luco Valley, and Domingo is in Tupungato, which is close to the Adriana vineyard. Very stony soil. And we've been making this blend since the early 90s. It's the same vineyards that go into this, except for the first vintage was mostly from La Pirámide. And then as these other vineyards became older, we started adding them. And I love this wine. Every year, you know, it changes a little bit because of vintage, but we always keep the same level of elegance and concentration. I don't know, Toby, if you have any comments.
No, I love it because I think, you know, unripe Cabernet is green, overripe Cabernet is slightly jammy and cassis. And I think the fraction between them, which I sort of say cedro, balsamico, I think is ripe pyrazines. And I think you actually get that right because you have a little bit of leaf cover, don't you, to keep that fraction, but not so much that it goes green or not so little that it goes jammy. So I think you have this really fresh, cedar for me is a noble expression of Cabernet. And I think, again, it happens at medium ripeness, not too low, not too high.
Exactly.
So you get both this lovely cedary aroma and ripe tannins and a freshness on the palate. So I love this. I love the elegance of this Cabernet. I think it's beautiful.
Thank you. Well, one of our guests said, stunning wine, and gave us a thumbs up. Thank you for that.
Laura, we must leave time to talk about Malbec Argentino because I mean, I don't normally talk about labels, but I mean, I know you were involved in this, and it is a really beautiful label. Not only beautiful, but thoughtful and very apt. Explain a bit about the story of the label.
And listen, I was also scared about such a beautiful label that people would think I didn't put a great wine inside. So I told our winemaking team, I said, you know what? This wine has to be so stunning that people don't say that it's all label. And so it comes from old vines. And the wine is also like the essence of Malbec. It's very rich, very velvety. It's kind of a bigger wine, and that was the intention. But for the label,
and a lot of this comes from your lunta, doesn't it? You took some cuttings, I think, which is one of your oldest vineyards, isn't it?
It so comes from a 100-year-old vineyard and a almost 30-year-old vineyard. So the average age, you know, is they're around 60-something years old.
And Lunta is a beautiful vineyard, isn't it? It's right on the banks of the river.
I love it.
With a beautiful view to the mountains. It's really the heart of classic Mendoza, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and it's the heart of our winery because that's where the plant selection comes from. If we didn't have that vineyard, we wouldn't have that unique plant selection. So the way this label was born was that I kept on getting asked by people, what comes to Argentina after Malbec? And, you know, Malbec has been around for 2,000 years. It's survived, you know, the Bordelais trying to destroy the French from Cahors. It survived the 100-Year War, you know, with Eleanor of Aquitaine's, you know, her children and France and England. You know, it survived phylloxera by going to Argentina. It survived being pulled out in Argentina. 70% of the Malbec was being pulled out. When my father decided to make a great Malbec, Malbec had gone down from 50,000 hectares to 12,000 hectares. It was on its way out. So Malbec has survived all these things. And I was thinking, and now these people are asking me what comes after Malbec. Malbec is here to stay because it tastes good. It's like dark chocolate. Would you ever ask somebody what happens after dark chocolate? No. Or what happens after coffee? Like, you know, after coffee, more coffee. You know, occasionally drink some tea. That would be my answer. You know, and that might be different than your answer. But anyhow.
Explain the female figures.
Yes. Okay. So I went to my sister, who, you know, the one that has this PhD from Oxford. And I said, Adriana, help me tell the story of Malbec. And I thought she was going to help me with a PowerPoint. Instead, she said, let's put the story on the label. And she said, you know what? I'm tired of history being told by men. Let's use these amazing female figures in the story, because I'm not the historian, but I've done all the research. So the first one is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who famously drank Malbec at her wedding to Henry II. You probably know a lot more about that than I do. Then the second woman represents the immigrants, and she is painted after Saint Sebastian because my sister wanted to make a contemporary comment about the struggle of the immigrants throughout history, you know, back then and today. And so she represents the immigrants that planted the vines in Argentina in the early 20th century and late 19th century. Then the third one is an insect. It's Madame Phylloxera. But interestingly, the insect Phylloxera could not be destroyed, partly because the males couldn't be found. And many of the methods to get rid of an insect is by stopping the reproductive cycle. So Phylloxera is mostly female. So the villain is also female. And that was important to me. I didn't want it to be all nice women. Like every story needs a woman villain. And we all know also that a female villain, it's a lot more villain than a male villain.
Lady Macbeth is the most frightening of all.
Exactly. The Lady Macbeth. And then the fourth one is my sister, who created the idea for this. And she wanted it to be me, but I won because I'm older and it's her. But when she tells the story, she says it's me. But if she ever tells you the story, it's her. And she is sitting on a map with South America and the pyramid. You see all the way. And there's lots of other hints. Like there's the boat that brought Malbec to Argentina. There's the bridge of Cahors. There's a monkey from Eleanor's court. And there's lots of little things that you can see. Oh, there's a website, malbecargentino.com. Kendi, if you want to put it in the chat, www.malbecargentino.com, where you can read. And there's a little video with the women speaking.
Yes, I know. I've seen the video, and we're going to try and put it up on our website. So, thank you. It's beautiful. But what a lovely story, and the wine is amazing, isn't it? It's so velvety.
I love this wine.
Aterciopelado. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Aterciopelado, muy bien. Oh, Bruno
it's very
is
rich.
Here. He likes the video. Bruno likes the video.
It's very rich and powerful, isn't it? Sensual. It's
very sensual.
Great depth of flavor, hasn't it? Caresses the mouth.
Yes, absolutely.
It's beautiful wine.
Yes.
Well, Catherine, I guess we're coming towards the end, are we? Do you have any more questions?
We do have some questions. So if you're happy to both stick around for maybe a few minutes more, it might slightly be over our half past, but we can ask them. And members, if you're unable to stick around, we are recording this, so you can catch up if you need to sort of head off. But we do have some questions that I'd love to be able to address.
Absolutely. Yes.
Firstly, I would just like to say I've had the Historic Rose Chardonnay, and it is delicious, and I've got my eye on the Zapata, mainly for the label, but now that I've heard all about the wine, I'm really excited to try that as well. So let's go for the next question, which is one that I'm going to combine. It's about variety. So obviously we've just been hearing, Laura, you say about how, Malbec is here to stay, and it's why what else is next, and what other things are there. So we've had a couple of questions from Roland Morley and from James about different varieties. So Roland is asking, in regards to the variation in the topography and the climate, why not consider more Pinot Noir? That might be something that you are already doing. And then on the flip side, James is asking, why not Grenache? So I think the broader question is, obviously you've got the Chardonnay, Malbec, but what other varieties are there that you are perhaps focusing on, or that you're perhaps excited by for the future?
Absolutely. Well, first, actually, before some people go, I want to show our book, which, Toby, have you received a copy?
You sent it to me today, so I'm delighted. I'm going to read it with pleasure.
So it's basically an illustrated book about Malbec, and it tells the history and also the geology, but it can really be read by anybody that just knows a little bit about wine. There's lots of stuff for wine nerds, but also if you're not an expert, you will find things to enjoy. And actually, surprisingly, it made it to the bestseller list in Argentina, which no wine book has ever made it. And it was reviewed by the New York Times, which is a very big deal. So the book, I was not so sure about an illustrated book about wine, but now I'm feeling very confident because it's also selling very well. And it is available in UK for people to buy on, not just on Amazon. There's like a couple of bookstores, but I suggest you just, if you're interested, you just Google. So in terms of other varieties, yes, I mean, like my great-grandfather, the Italian, Nicola, he used to eat a piece of steak for breakfast every morning. And one time my father asked him, like, why are you having steak for breakfast? And he would say, I want to remind myself of how lucky I was to choose Argentina as my destination. I think there's other Italian immigrants who don't feel that way with our economy, but at least back then, he said that. And he also thought that it was just heaven for winemaking. The only thing he always complained about were the yields. He always used to complain that the yields were so much higher in Italy. And we have these well-drained soils, everything we've been talking about. It's hard to get high yields in Mendoza. But we have this terroir, at the different altitudes, different soils, where you can grow so many different varieties. And for example, Bonarda is the second most widely planted variety in Argentina. It's Charbonneau de Savoie. It makes this fruit forward, nice, like it's a wine with like this sweet and sour sort of taste that I love. Blends really well with Malbec. In Argentina, the traditional blend, and we actually make a wine with this blend that we're selling that's called Tinto Histórico, where we blend Malbec, Petit Verdot, which used to be all in the same vineyard. People would plant both together and they would call it the French grape. And then you add a little Bonarda. So you get the structure from the Petit Verdot, you get the, the kind of overall greatness of the Malbec, and then the fruit sweet and sour from the Bonarda. And it just is this beautiful, really drinkable wine. So I think blends will be interesting for Argentina. I think Bonarda is interesting. You asked about Pinot Noir. I actually make a Pinot Noir. My father and I have been planting Pinot Noir since the early 90s because we love drinking Pinot Noir from France and from all over the world. I mean, I love the New Zealand stuff. I mean, some of the US, the Oregon Pinot Noir. And we have been selling our Pinot Noir mostly in Argentina and a little bit of export. With great success. There's also, but again, you don't see a lot in exports, and that's one of the problems. That's where you need somebody like Toby that goes and stands at the winery and says, "Give me this, or else I'm not."
Laura,
leaving.
I think you're getting there with your Pinot Noir.
No,
but
I know.
But for me, I feel slightly that you could be braver because if you plant Malbec in Rio Negro, at 200 meters. It's not so different from it's 14 degrees. It's not so different from a Malbec in Mendoza, or at 1100, or a Malbec in Cafayate at 1600. Why don't you go right to the south to Chubut, further south, where you're in the rain shadow of the Andes, so it's dry but it's cool. I mean, it's partly the human problem, isn't it? Because there are no hospitals, there's no infrastructure. It might be fine for a winemaker and his dog, but his family is miles away. But I think there's massive potential. Do you think for things like Pinot in the south, in Chubut and further south?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I think the best stuff that I'm seeing is actually from very high altitude in Mendoza, from a place called Gualtallarí Alto. I agree with you. I'm sure if you went all the way south, I mean, already the Rio Negro Pinot Noir I think is delicious, but I still think I would like a little cooler climate personally, because actually where we're at in Gualtallarí Alto is cooler than Rio Negro. But we don't have the river. Like, it's a different kind of coolness. It's the high altitude
Rio
coolness.
Negro is a desert, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I went to Rio Negro and thought, where are the mountains? And it's right in a massive plain with tumbleweed. But I mean, when you get closer to the mountains in Chubut and so forth, it's beautiful, isn't it?
So, cool. I mean, listen, Argentina is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And as you said, this by the mountains regions, which, again, in Patagonia, the altitude is lower, but it's further south. So there's different problems and advantages to each place. I have no doubt that there is so much left to explore in Argentina. We now have vineyards in Salta, we have vineyards in La Rioja, we have vineyards in San Juan, we have vineyards in Patagonia, in Rio Negro, and in La Pampa. And, the Catena Institute, which I founded in 1995, that's one of their jobs, to try varieties, other varieties in Mendoza, in other regions. And we're actively planting, and we're buying in a place that I can't tell you because then a lot of people are going to go buy there. But we are actively looking at other regions. And Grenache, interesting question, because Alejandro, our winemaker, is obsessed with Grenache, and he just planted some in this little spot in the Angelica vineyard that Toby likes. So Toby, next time you go to Angelica, have Alejandro show you the Grenache, because he's very proud of it. And he planted it with,
bush vines.
Bush vines. Yes.
Yeah.
But I think in Basso, there's so much that can be done in Argentina. And as you said, some of the restrictions are the fact that it's in the middle of nowhere, that there's no electricity, and that's an important issue. Some of them are the different provinces have different kinds of government. Argentina is the state or the provincial government is quite powerful as opposed to the federal government. So they can put all kinds of rules just because they thought so. So there's an issue when some provinces are friendlier to wine than others. And that's one of the things that, I hate politics. I try to have the least amount to do with it, but you do need to understand what's the the general policy towards wine in a certain province, because you don't want to go in a place where they don't want to support your industry. So I agree with you. I think there's so much left to explore in Argentina. I'm so excited about the next 200 years. I really am, Toby. My challenge to my team is how are we going to be making great wine in Argentina in 200 years? That was the last challenge I gave them at the Catena Institute. I think Toby might be frozen, but he's frozen in like a very sort of Roman emperor stance.
I think he is.
I
think we've got him back now.
God. Somebody please take a picture of him. You look like a Roman emperor, Toby. It was great.
That was a great answer, Laura, because that's also covered off 2 other questions that I had prepped, but that's been answered, so that's wonderful. I think the only last question that I will ask for this evening, and members, thank you for sticking around. I don't want to leave, but we will have to at some point, is obviously, I think a lot of us now are very keen to come and see you, but I understand you've been doing some building work. So in terms of visiting the winery, what sort of, say in a year or so, if we wanted to get...
Oh, for sure. In a year, we are hoping to be able to open by April, at least the pyramid, but we have an area for hospitality in the front of the winery. That's actually the old underground winery that was there when we purchased the vineyard, and that we had been using to make sparkling. And then now it's become this labyrinth that you go in through this labyrinth, and there's a tower, La Torre Katena, and there's going to be a restaurant that the management is going to be under Alejandro, our head winemaker, who has his own restaurant in his house, will be staffing the restaurant. So we have this wonderful project that hopefully you're going to want to go and spend the whole day with us, where we're going to have theater and poetry and really interesting learning about sustainability and farming. Is going to be so much fun. That might not be ready for maybe a little under a year, but we will be opening slowly, hopefully by April, the pyramid. Yeah.
It sounds wonderful, and I will definitely be planning a trip. So,
oh, somebody bought the book. Yay, Alan. Thank you.
While watching, well done, Alan.
Yes.
We can all go and buy some books, buy some Catena wines. It's
wonderful.
Just been a wonderful hour. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Toby, for sharing your passion, your enthusiasm. Someone in the chat, well, a few people actually just remarked on your infectious enthusiasm, and I just have to agree, Laura. Thank you so much, and I can't think of a better event to lead us into International Women's Day next week. Particularly with the story of the label. I
will be in the vineyards all that day, trying to take pictures of all the women that I find. But what I love about Katena is that we have a really mixed group of men and women, and I always say that the biggest fans of women at our winery are the men. Like, they do not want to work in all male groups. They're always trying to recruit women to be on their teams, and they're jealous of teams that have more women, because we love mixed teams. Just like diverse vines, we like diverse vines and diverse groups of people. And that's what's wonderful about hopefully where we're headed. We have some bad things happening, but I think there's also good things in the future.
Laura, it's been an absolute pleasure. We could have talked for hours, and maybe we can do this again, because you have so much to say, and you put it forward. You're so enthusiastic and delight to listen to. Have you got a couple of words on the vintage, though? The vintage that's coming up. How's it looking? How's it looking? The 2022.
So 2022, so far so good. Mostly nothing bad has happened. The only problem, and this will be a problem for you, Toby, is that the grape prices are predicted to triple. I'm not kidding you, because the yields are not that high and the inflation has been so high. So this is the main issue, is that, and for our grapes, we produce our own grapes, but we're also affected by these macroeconomic things. But for wines where we buy grapes, the cost, also it's just climate change. The yields are down, and people have not, I think people have not planted as much as they should have potentially. This is a cycle in viticulture. This happens, like my father, like he always says to me, like, Laurita, let me tell you how this is going to go, because, you know, he's 80 years old. He's like, first, you know, the prices go down, and then everybody doesn't plant because they say, oh, the prices were low. Why would I plant? And then there's higher demand, and then the prices go up, and then people start planting, and then it happens again, and it's over and over. So
there's always a lag, isn't there, between demand and then taste change. People want Chardonnay and they want something else, and you can't foresee it all. It's very difficult.
My dad always says, you know, like, just kind of do what you need to do to keep the quality right, and the rest will sort itself out. So that's the only bad thing. But in terms of quality, you know, 21, 22 so far, nothing bad has happened.
Just keep making good wine, and then there's
We'll
always a
try.
market for good wine. Laura, thank you so much.
Okay.
Catherine, do you have anything more to say, or no?
No, just to finish the thank you, and members, start saving your pennies, because I agree, Laura, keep making excellent wine.
Okay, no, but hopefully I don't want to scare people, but yes, that is the one issue, is the prices of the grapes. But yeah. Okay.
Lily, thank you so
Laura,
much.
thank you so
everybody.
much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.